What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we're quite excited to have back on the show Moss Robeson. He's written a bevy of pieces about Ukraine and the rise of neo-Nazism and white supremacy there, especially tracing back to Stepan Bandera, and I suppose you would call the neo-Banderites that are taking hold there. And Moss just published a piece recently with the Gray Zone about how the Biden administration, in particular with one nominee who's since been rejected, is dealing with Ukraine and Russia as well. So we're going to be talking to Moss about that today. And Moss, an independent writer and researcher, which I don't know if I already said, but if I did, I'm saying it again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to be back after, I don't know, it's almost a half a year now, or 6 months or so.
Has it really been that long?
I think it was like October.
Ugh, that's unacceptable.
It's been a while.
We need to have you back more often. Ridiculous.
I think we did one this year.
No, I think we did.
I don't think so.
We did a few leading up to the election, and then after that, I didn't do anything for a few months, and
yeah.
But it's good to be back.
It's good to have you back finally.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Time's been so distorted during this COVID
Seriously.
era. So let's start, if we can, with what's happened recently in the Biden administration. You wrote this piece for the Gray Zone titled "Ukrainian Ultranationalist Lobby Flaunts Influence Over Biden, Blocks Top Russia Experts Appointment." So can you give a brief summary of that? Or it doesn't have to be brief, but just summarize or break down what's happened with that.
Yeah, so the Biden administration was reportedly leaning towards appointing this guy, Matthew Rojansky, who's he's the director of the Kennan Institute, which is housed at the Wilson Center in DC. And the Kennan Institute was founded, I want to say in the 70s, originally a think tank focused on the Soviet Union, named for, of course, George Kennan, who's like the architect of the US Cold War strategy of containing the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And
if I could just interject real quick, George Kennan, he said almost immediately following the end of World War II that the US's, I'm paraphrasing, but the US's goal now is to, as much as possible, gain control over strategic resources around the world, including the Middle East, including Latin America, South America. So not a good guy we're talking about here.
Yeah, he's an interesting figure because, like when you talk about like the U.S. history and the Cold War of supporting Nazi collaborators and stuff, he's someone who helped get the ball rolling on that, but then like became against it and almost kind of created this monster that he didn't, in the end of the day, approve of. And he later didn't support when he didn't think NATO should expand, into Eastern Europe, and so it's like it's just ironic because he probably would be considered like a Putin apologist or too soft on Russia today. And so the Kennan Institute, I think they closed an office in Moscow, I want to say 2014, 2015, because of like pressure from the Russian government. And then in, I want to say 2018 or so, their office in Kiev closed because of pressure from basically Ukrainian nationalists who were alumni of the Kennan Institute. I'm forgetting the name, but they got a new director. Rojansky hired a new director for their office in Ukraine, and someone who had made comments that were critical of the Euromaidan, or the 2013-14 so-called Revolution of Dignity, in Ukraine, basically just saying it had, or like one of the more so-called offensive comments that this person had made was essentially that the Maidan had just led to an increase in nationalism and corruption and a decline in freedoms. And for comments like that, he was, I want to say, like, let's say 30 or so alumni of the Kennan Institute in Ukraine came out and wrote this open letter, basically a smear campaign saying that the Kennan Institute was drifting towards pro-Russian policies. And as a result of all this, their office closed in Ukraine or in Kiev. And so that was, I think, the last office of theirs in the former Soviet Union. So of this think tank that is focused on the former Soviet Union. And that's kind of all tangent. But anyways, Rozhansky is the head of this Kennan Institute. And he's he's not like a hawk or a dove, but he is like this like realist who I just recently watched a video where he was asked about the two major misconceptions Americans have about Russia. And I think the main thing he had to say was that, there's no winning, like the US can't win against Russia. Like at best we can live in peaceful coexistence. And that was one of the things too that he's been hammered for, which is just so crazy that he made a comment saying that
About peace.
Yeah, that peaceful coexistence is necessary no matter how much people might not like Putin or his government. Peaceful coexistence is not it's mandatory, and so for that he's been accused of himself being soft on Russia and comments like that. So Axios broke the news of his appointment, and the article I think was basically a hit job because it framed it as it was something like, Biden administration to appoint or considering appointment of someone who's been criticized as soft on Russia. And to back that up, they, aside from highlighting these comments of his that shouldn't be controversial and presenting them as if they should be, they cited the smear campaign against the Kennan Institute in Ukraine that, didn't like go into the context of it, or didn't, give the other side, for example, that there was like some 50 academics who signed a letter in support of the new director in Ukraine that was the center of this whole smear campaign. And so anyways, this Axios article, probably as intended, inspired all this uproar against Rozhansky from like Russia hawks like Bill Browder, who have a very large Twitter account, and other people like at the Atlantic Council. And then in addition to that, the I guess what you could call the Ukraine lobby in this country, and I call the Bandera lobby, mobilized to join that chorus. And who's to say really who exactly is the one who stopped the appointment? But altogether, this chorus of people did succeed. And when Politico reported that that this guy Rozhansky was no longer being considered, they credited the Ukrainian Congress Committee for America for their leadership in this. And the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, UCCA, also known in Ukrainian as the UKK, was happy to take credit for that. And maybe that's, to be expected. But still, I mean, basically that's where this article is coming from, is that, if they're going to get credit for this, then, let's take a closer look at who these people are.
Yeah, and I just want to read a paragraph from your piece at the Gray Zone that I think emphasizes what you just described. The UCCA, which, as you said, is the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, made its opposition to Rozhansky known in the form of an, quote, emphatic request, unquote, to President Joseph Biden, accusing the veteran Russian hand of making unspecified, quote, incendiary comments over the years, unquote, which supposedly indicated that, quote, Ukraine is expendable to secure closer US-Russia relations, unquote. And that struck me so much, not just the vagueness of it, but also some of the other language that's used. Incendiary comments, like what does that mean? Incendiary means typically that something's on fire. So what was he speaking with fire coming out of his mouth?
He's a fire-breathing dragon, Jesse. You didn't know?
Point being that the accusations against him as to why he's unfit for the job they border on childish nonsense. So
Oh yeah. And I mean, it's like and again, not again, but this these letters by the UCCA leaders, or the emphatic requests, were written in response to this Axios article. So some of the things that the incendiary comments presumably are referenced to that article are the ones quoted in that article, such as Russia is not going to go away, and a reference to America's, quote, Cold War style paranoia about the Russian bogeyman.
And there's another one that I was just reading here too, that, quote, peaceful coexistence with Russia remains an imperative. I mean, these are common sense, like Russia's not going away. Duh. Like, why is that a controversial thing for anybody to say? And this is not like a guy who, I don't know much about him other than just what I've read in your article. And I did a little bit of like other, side reading, but he at least seems to be qualified for the job. He seems to have an expertise. He knows kind of what he's doing. So it really seems that these people are just pissed because he thinks that there should be peace with Russia, which any person with any brain activity whatsoever should think that that's a good thing. It's really weird, that's something that they're opposed to.
And now all the national security and intelligence people who were out of the job when Trump was president are mostly coming back into the fold, and they're sort of cri de quoi is being anti-Russian and trying to incite not just a new Red Scare, but a new Cold War, because it's one of the only things that justifies their existence anymore. And there's Russophobia definitely mixed in there. This fear.
And there are a lot of Russia gators that have been welcomed into the fold.
Right.
And so this guy who has like a common sense approach is probably not all that welcome within that group.
Yeah, there were people who were saying, like on Twitter and stuff, including people who work at the Wilson Center, the parent body for this think tank, were saying like, Rozhansky would be great because he brings a more nuanced perspective. It'd be good to have, different points of view in the Biden administration. And I feel like those people are missing the point of this whole smear campaign, because the whole campaign against him was to ensure that there is no debate and that there is no point of difference. So it's, I put that in the conclusion of the article, but to me, that's what this is all about, is to
I think that they don't want opposing voices. There should be no dissent. They want groupthink.
Like a Russiagate maniac consensus,
Yeah, which is terrifying.
There's the one development that you point out, they being the Chicago leaders of this, is it the Senate Ukraine caucus? Led by Dick Durbin, who's from Illinois. The Chicago leaders objected to Rozhansky's seemingly benign observation that, quote, peaceful coexistence with Russia remains an imperative, unquote, likening the statement to, quote, appeasement, unquote. They also basically suggested, or baselessly suggested, that Rozhansky might be, quote, influenced because of overt or covert financial support from Russia, unquote. This is cribbing off of Russiagate so hardcore and so transparently that if you don't see it, I don't know what your condition is.
You might be Rachel Maddow.
Yeah. But Moss, maybe you can speak to this more. It's just disturbingly amazing how there's no evidence presented whatsoever. And
I was going to ask that. Is there any evidence that this guy has had any financial support in any way, shape, or form from Russia? Or
No,
is this just conjecture? Like they're just saying it's possible. It's possible.
yeah, I think it's based, again, going back to this like Ukrainian-based smear campaign against the Kennan Institute a few years ago. I think that's the basis of that speculation. Is this idea that the Kennan Institute is receiving some kind of Russian, pro-Russian money or whatever, and that, that's but something funny and a small anecdote that speaks to their paranoia. One of the people who wrote that letter, the vice president of the Chicago or Illinois division of the Ukrainian Congress Committee, his name's Pavlo Banderivsky, which is funny because it sounds like Banderivsky, or Banderovsky, which is the Russian word for Banderite, or which, for followers or people who
in Ukrainian it's in plural, as far as I know, they're referred to as Banderitsi.
Yeah, and so it kind of sounds like somewhere in between those two. And but so for those listening who don't know, that's a word for followers of Stepan Bandera, Ukrainian fascist leader who was assassinated by the KGB in 1959. And I think of him as kind of like the wannabe Hitler of Ukraine, wannabe because he never actually had like a real government, but he was this like fascist Ukrainian leader with like cult like followers and basically a genocidal worldview.
He was a Nazi collaborator.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
A real one.
Yeah.
Like a real one.
I mean, it's a little complicated. It's like his record with the Nazis is a little complicated, but if anything, it's more like the Nazis were anti-Ukrainian as opposed to the Bandera people being anti-Nazi, as they like to now falsely remember it. And anyways, about this guy Banderivsky, the day before this letter, or the day before this letter and the day after the Axios article, he incidentally wrote an article in which he's describing me kind of just more as like in passing, as just like a factual thing that I've got some kind of like handlers who are overseeing me, basically suggesting that I'm like a Russian agent.
Well, you do, and Misty and I are your secret handlers.
Right. So, I mean, that just, and, obviously I know that there's no basis to that. So to me, that just speaks to, just how, one, paranoid, and two, how freely they feel to just, smear whoever they don't like as a Putin puppet or whatever.
I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that not a lot of people are paying attention to Ukraine and therefore don't know much about the internal political and then the geopolitical dynamics of Ukraine and
how prevalent the Ukrainian lobby is in the States and how influential it is,
right?
Particularly over Biden, it seems.
That's what I was going to add on, is that because there's such a lack of knowledge, and that's in big part due to the fact that mainstream media doesn't cover it or hardly covers what's happening in Ukraine. Because of that void, when baseless claims are made, people take them at face value and accept them because of a lack of knowledge. And I'm not criticizing those people for being stupid. It's just ignorance that everybody's busy, and you sit down and you watch your 30 minutes of mainstream media and you think you're getting informed, and
right.
You're not. It's not presented even anywhere close to accurate in mainstream media. No. So I think that's why it's just, it's not even easy. You can do it in your sleep. Just make an anti-Russian suggestion and people will take it as gospel.
Yes, especially now.
And I think it also adds something too when it's coming from an organization which describes itself as the spokesbody for the like 1 point something million Ukrainian Americans. When in fact, this organization doesn't represent them at all. It's technically an umbrella organization of other organizations. But
are you talking about UCCA now?
yes, yeah.
Okay.
But it's
I was
like
going to say maybe we should kind of go over what that is,
Right,
who they
sorry.
represent. Yeah, no. That's that. I was just where I was getting ready to go.
Yeah.
Just because I was just going to say it's in the name, it's not the Ukrainian Congress, it's the Ukrainian Congress Committee.
Yeah, and,
you know.
and also you have a section about the Banderites taking over the UCCA, so it would be good to talk
Get a
about
little
that as
backstory
well.
and how that's
Yeah.
happening. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, it's been something that's been ongoing for decades. In part, 1949, a guy named Lev Dobryansky became the president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. He remained the president into the 1980s until he served like I think 10 consecutive terms. In 1982, he was appointed as ambassador to the Bahamas, which I thought was funny. Doesn't really have seemingly anything to do.
I didn't even know there was an ambassador to the
I would like that job.
Yeah, well, so I remember
What do you
asking
do? Just
somebody,
lie on a beach
just go sit
chair?
on a beach. Yeah, I would like, I'll do that.
I mean, I think that's essentially what he was doing based on how tan he was in those years. He also
he was just doing a lot of outdoor diplomacy.
yeah,
Right.
well, he may have actually had something to do with as the ambassador, he like scuttled, I want to say at least 3 different like sting operations that the FBI or DEA had set up to, in terms of targeting like notorious drug smuggling and stuff that was going through the Bahamas. And so that, kind of fits in the whole Reagan thing of, this is a whole can of worms, but Lev Dobryansky had an important role to play in the behind the scenes in something called the World Anti-Communist League, which is basically the like fascist international of the Cold War era. It's mainly a private thing, although it did get wrapped up into like the Iran-Contra scandal and did seemingly have ties to like the international drug trade and stuff. And so there is, questions. But anyways, Dobryansky is someone who was pretty, I don't know if he was a member of Bandera's organization, but he was certainly, I think, their key ally, at least in the Ukrainian American community. And so under his long tenure of the Congress Committee, the Banderites increasingly had a large role to play, climaxing in 1980, which I assume would be the last convention that he presided over. Actually, I think October 1980, so just on the eve of the election that Reagan won, obviously, they orchestrated what has been described as a coup of the Congress Committee. And it led to basically all the non-Banderite groups leading a walkout and forming.
This is something we talked about, or at least
Did we?
touched
Okay.
on in our first
Briefly, but it's always good to
discussion.
give a good
I'm not
review.
I'm not telling you to stop describing it. I'm just, for anybody who's watching, we also
You should go check out our other conversations with Moss.
Well, but long story short, it's just that there is a documented history of the Banderites playing a large role in this organization and then doing basically like a full takeover of the organization, 1980, which some representatives of those who left were welcomed back into the fold. I want to say early 2000s, but by all appearances, the Banderites have remained in control of the Congress Committee. So then fast forward to the summer of 2019, there's this guy, and I've previously written about him, and maybe we even talked about this whistleblower in the previous episode, but this is the first time in this article that I named him. This whistleblower wrote this pretty sensational, or no, actually not. wrote this complaint. I'm thinking of a different guy, but wrote this complaint about the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and submitted it to the Charities Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. And he did that about a week before he died. His name was Yaroslav Fedun, Fedun. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But actually, he was the chairman of the audit committee of the Congress Committee. He was a member for some like 45 years. And so he wrote this complaint about what he called the egregious improprieties in the organization, all these conflict of interest situations with the board of directors, and essentially just saying it's a corrupt organization. And blanking on the word I'm looking for. But anyways, he died, and shortly before he died, he got this complaint in the hands of someone who I still don't know who it is, but just say an anonymous confidant, who in turn submitted his complaint and then wrote his own complaint at the end of the summer, which is the sensational thing that I was referencing. And I don't know, the more I learn about this stuff, the more this complaint seems to hold up. But upon first reading, it does read like it's just too it's hard to believe some of it, because it's just so, there's accusations that, you know, this is like a terrorist movement, it's a secret anti-Semitic movement, it's
labyrinthine, to be sure.
Yeah.
Not just trying to keep track of the acronyms, but all the machinations that have been done and all the nexuses between these different groups, and which group stands for and what a different group stands for. And I don't know if that's done intentionally or if there's just like a developing fetish for neo-Nazism and white supremacy in Ukraine, but it's labyrinthine, to be sure.
Definitely. And I mean, I put these people in a different category as straight up neo-Nazis. I mean, I think like Bandera and his followers, they weren't, like, I get it when people refer to them as Ukrainian Nazis. I mean, I feel like that's almost kind of like referring to like Italian capital F fascists as Italian Nazis, isn't like, you know, it's like obvious what the point is, but not quite accurate.
Well, I just
what?
say that
Okay.
because the people who are operating in the present day, who you can almost directly trace back to Bandera, who collaborated with Nazis.
Right. No, that's what I was going to say, is that they're not Nazis, but Nazi collaborators. And then these people who control the diaspora are not neo-Nazis, but neo-Nazi collaborators.
Right.
More or less.
I think that's a good distinction to make.
And yeah, but so this anonymous confidant of the chairman of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America's audit committee, among other things, alleged, and it all makes sense given everything we know about this group, that a majority of its board members and its staff are members of Bandera's organization, which they refer to as the OUNR, but is more well known in English as the OUNB for Bandera or Banderites, and the R stands for revolutionary or revolutionaries, because that was originally how they described themselves, was as the revolutionary faction of the OUN. Yeah, and so it's just kind of crazy that there's this you know, I kind of can never really get over it. Part of the reason I can't get over it is because journalists don't like talk about this.
Never.
That there's this clandestine, like, for all the talk about Bandera, like so many people, you know, who may not really even know anything else about Ukraine will know the name Stepan Bandera as a result of the last, you know, since 2014 or so. And yet, for all the talk about Bandera, there's no talk about the fact that Bandera's organization controls such a huge swath of the Ukrainian diaspora, in addition to having its own network in Ukraine. Yeah, I
Well, and
think
it's also very interesting that people in the United States want to talk so much about anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And here is a group operating within the United States that is very much both of those things. But nobody talks about it. And nobody talks about the connection to Biden because, Biden right now is, going to give us Patriot Act 2.0 because of white supremacy. But, he very much has a connection to, these Ukrainian groups, which is interesting. And it's probably why we don't hear a lot about it in mainstream media. They have to talk about Jill Biden scrunchies. It's more important.
It's
Um,
it's an insidious movement in a way too, because it's hard to know when these gatherings are going down. And Max Blumenthal has done a really good job. He went to an event where Andre Perubi was speaking, I believe, who's been photographed in a brown shirt in Sieg Heiling, if I'm not mistaken. I think he's in a brown shirt on some book he wrote, some obscure book he wrote, but has a lot to do with Ukrainian nationalism and ultra nationalism.
there was a picture on Twitter
But
yesterday with side-by-side pictures of what Russia was doing to celebrate Victory Day. And then there were people in Ukraine like laying flowers in remembrance of Nazis.
right.
It's very interesting.
But I think that lack of historical knowledge, the lack of, because it's not covered in mainstream media, people largely don't care. And it's because of that such a murky narrative. And what gets obscured in that is how directly linked to US foreign policy Ukraine is, especially now that Biden is back in the White House, and he was a large facilitator in what happened in Maidan, and then supporting neo-Nazi or Nazi collaborator, I would say in this case neo-Nazis, proxies in Maidan to eventually remove Yanukovych, and then we see the rise of the Azov Battalion and similar groups. But the murkiness of it, I think, lets all of this happen, and there's virtually no coverage of it in the United States outside of independent media. So
I do think at the very least, like historically, the US has responsibility in terms of, also just another quick background, there's the OUNB, or Bandera's organization, Ukrainian nationalists, and they created something called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA, or what's called the UPA. And without getting too into that, the CIA basically didn't support the OUNB itself, but like former members of the OUNB who created their own little group and said, we distance ourselves from Bandera, we believe in democracy and all that. Even though some of the guy who was leading it, Mykola Lebed, was arguably a bigger war criminal than Bandera, and at one point was like his number 2 or number 3, but was the acting leader of the OUNB during like 1941 to parts of 41 to 42, when as like the Holocaust was ramping up. And anyways, the CIA was saying, we don't support Bandera and the OUNB, but we support this other guy. And they also tried to support the Ukrainian Insurgent Army essentially as like a Gladio type stay behind force, but actually behind the Soviet lines, which was doomed from the beginning. But so in trying to make this distinction of like Bandera bad, UPA and others good, I think really blurred the lines and muddied the waters a lot. And I think if nothing else, I think the US government does have responsibility for, if only indirectly, facilitating the whitewashing and the rehabilitation of Bandera and others like him in Ukraine, or in post-Soviet Ukraine. And because, of course, we don't really know exactly what the CIA has been doing in the 21st century. And we can make informed speculation. It does seem to me like there's numbers of things that you could very well argue are like CIA fingerprints or things that suggest that there was some kind of reconciliation. Um, a part of an aspect of this stuff that I wrote about in this article, and I've written, I think we've probably talked about when I was on previous shows, was this front group based in DC and New York called the Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations. And that was launched in 2000. Just one quick thing we could probably spend this whole thing talking about this one organization, but just one thing is the first two events they did are 2000, 2001. They had a steering committee. The steering committee is like almost always has a Banderite majority, but the steering committee originally was chaired by this guy who OUNB had declared like this short-lived pro-Nazi government in German-occupied Western Ukraine in 1941. So the chairman of this thing in 2000, 2001 was the honorary spokesperson, like in exile, of this like pro-Nazi government that lasted like a week that they set up in 1941. And anyways, so this event or Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations, when it got started with the support or blessings of groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, like Freedom House, like, those sorts, like the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, which are like the democracy promotion arms of the
they're
Democratic
basically
Republican Party.
soft coup cutouts of the U.S. government which
like these,
go in and pretend that they're delivering humanitarian aid while they're really working to overthrow a government they disapprove of.
And there's actually a connection back to the thing you mentioned with Max Blumenthal attending this event. The guy Perubi, who at that time, I want to say that was about 2018 or so, was the chairman of Ukraine's parliament, but in the 1990s had co-founded the Social National Party of Ukraine, which was a neo-Nazi party. They also used a Wolfsangel swastika in their flag, as if the name Social Nationalist wasn't obvious enough. But there are, I don't know that I've seen a picture of him doing a Sig Heil, but there are pictures of him with that swastika flag like right behind him. And so Max went to that event, which was hosted by the American Foreign Policy Council, which also houses their like offices in DC, houses the DC bureau of the Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations. Their founding president, Herman Perchner, is very close with the OUNB leaders in the United States. And he's actually, Max also broke this news, I believe, is that Perchner, as of like 2017-18, since Trump became president, became seemingly an inner circle member of the Council for National Policy, which is like basically like the cabal of the secret right. Had all these connections of the Trump administration, like Bannon and Kellyanne Conway, and it's kind of like a who's who of
psychopaths.
Yeah, basically. And it's a very secretive organization. Like every once in a while, someone will leak their membership lists. And
you said the Council on National Relations?
Council for National Policy, or CNP. Okay. The Southern Poverty Law Center describes it as like a key venue for where like mainstream and extremist right-wingers like can mix and whatever. And so this guy is a member of the board.
I just picture them drinking cocktails and talking.
I know.
Pretty much.
About ruining the world completely.
Yeah.
This guy Perchner was a member in recent years or at least within the last few years, member of the Board of Governors and a member of what's called the Gold Circle, which is apparently for high-level donors, maybe in the range of like $20,000 or something like that. So anyways, American Foreign Policy Council hosted this event with this guy Perubi to speak. And Max went just simply to ask, do you think it was a good idea to have this event with this guy who is co-founded a neo-Nazi party and has never disavowed his extremist, like white nationalist views? And so Herman Perchner more or less answered or didn't answer his question by doing this complete non sequitur to talk about Stepan Bandera, which to me, knowing what I know about Perchner's relationship with the OUNB people, seems to be reflective of him just regurgitating the talking points that they've essentially given him. And then also, funny enough, later found out that some of these like OUNB people were in the room also. But anyways, also about that event, said afterwards, Max went up and essentially asked the same question to Michael Carpenter, who we've also talked about before, who at that time, and I think still today, is the the managing director of the Penn Biden Center for Global Diplomacy and Engagement, which gotta love that name.
Is he in Biden's cabinet, or is he?
No, not at this time. And that's one of the things that I had kind of, I don't know if I predicted it, but basically did. And so far seem to have been wrong about that. But then again, who knows what's to come. Mike's predecessor as managing director of the Penn Biden Center was a guy named Antony Blinken. So I did kind of think that, you know, it might be that we were looking at a Mike and Tony reunion, but we'll see. Part of me wonders if maybe Carpenter's role is supposed to be like on the outside, like he's their whisperer to the blob or whatever.
Plausible deniability.
But he's a very there's a Russian historian, Sergei Radchenko, who he once tweeted something like, there's good Russia experts, there's bad Russia experts, there's really bad Russia experts, and then there's Michael Carpenter. He's one of these people who's always predicting either like the fall of Russia or an imminent invasion and stuff that never materializes. And he's just this extremely dogmatic Russia hawk who, you know, would just make perfect company with people like Tony Blinken and Victoria Nuland. And but so far he does not officially, to my knowledge, have a position in the Biden White House. But he's someone who, maybe I mentioned this last time, in a meeting with this group that was set up by the DNC to like reach Ukrainian voters in 2020, Ukrainian Americans for Biden. He said something like, the Biden administration will help Ukraine beat back this growing, by the way, Russian influence in Ukraine's like domestic political system or something. It was like a near verbatim quote. And so to me, it does seem, you know, with all the stuff that's been happening in Ukraine, of the Ukrainian government like drift towards like authoritarianism around the time Biden's coming into office, I do kind of wonder if someone like Michael Carpenter is sending signals to Kiev of the things like, here's what you can do to get on the good side of the Biden administration. That's just all to say, I think he's someone to still keep an eye on. Oh, that's what I said last time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And his name keeps popping up quite frequently. And it makes sense that at least temporarily they would keep him outside as an outside advisor. So
yeah, I think I think that you always have to have an outside guy working, you know, kind of outside the rules, not that they have rules, but you know what I mean, outside of visibility, you know, in a bigger way. It's not like you can be Anthony Blinken and get away with some of the more nefarious stuff so easily. But I just watched an interview that Anya Parampil did with Mark Sloboda, and he said that some ridiculous Russian expert had said that, you know, oh, we could see World War III, and Mark Sloboda said, no, I'm more worried about a civil war within Ukraine than I am about that. Is that something that you have kind of been picking up on, that kind of unrest that's being built up again within Ukraine?
I don't know. I guess I'm mainly focused on the Ukrainian diaspora and this like, kind of what I see is like a missing piece of the puzzle and this thing that most people who are focused on Ukraine aren't focused on. But then on the flip side, I'm not really focused on a lot of the things people are focused on. So I don't have much of a
Insight on that?
geopolitical analysis or like, terms of I'm not an expert in anything, but if I was an expert in anything, it would be more on like the Ukrainian diaspora and not like current events inside
Right.
Ukraine. Although I
Well,
did
when
try
we
to do a
talked to
little
you, yeah,
preparation for this,
when we
but
when we talked to you last, I think it was before Biden had been elected, and we asked you, what do you think it's going, the Biden administration, how they're going to interact with all of these groups, and what have you seen? Like, what have you noticed? Is it about what you expected? Is it worse? You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, I think like being tough on Russia, I think kind of goes hand in hand with the so-called like tough love versus you towards Ukraine. Um, the previous president of Ukraine, who was president from 2014 2019, Petro Poroshenko, Biden, when he was vice president, joked that he talked to Poroshenko sometimes more than he did his own wife. Biden was Obama's point person when it comes to Ukraine, and Michael Carpenter was to some extent Biden's point person on Russia and Ukraine. But anyways, there's kind of an issue with when the current president Zelensky, who was elected 2019, after Biden came to office, he took a, relatively speaking, a pretty long time to make a first phone call with Zelensky, which officials in Washington and Kiev were trying to downplay. But it does seem like it was pretty deliberate. There was, and that being said, like, as I was kind of getting at, let's see, there was like February 1st or 2nd. So like, right after the inauguration, the Ukrainian government, which I believe was an initiative of their National Security Council, but, officially done by the president, was to block these 3 TV channels in Ukraine that were associated with or owned by Viktor Medvedchuk, who was infamously, what is it? It's like Putin is the godfather of his daughter, or something like that. And he's these 3 TV channels associated with him and associated with like the pro-Russian political opposition in Ukraine. And this is something that the Poroshenko government never dared to do, and something that Zelensky's government did, apparently trying to get on Biden's good side. They then, when components from those 3 TV channels tried to create a new TV channel later that month, it was then banned. And more recently, Zelensky has moved to, I don't know if he actually did it or not, but to remove the head of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, like their Supreme Court. And more even recently than that, like a couple weeks ago, these TV channels still had their YouTube feeds, and that was like, I think the only thing they had left. And YouTube blocked them on the request of the Ukrainian government. So all of this seemingly is an effort to get on Biden's good side. And Zelensky did not get a phone call from Biden until April 2nd. And in between then, the US government was still sending signals that like Ukraine isn't even doing enough, even though it's like this, like, I don't know if unprecedented, but seemingly so unprecedented, like drift towards authoritarianism. And so if I could just read a couple things. On March 13th, like one of those things too is in early March, the US government put sanctions on this oligarch, Kolomoisky, who is seen as having some kind of relationship with Zelensky, or at least, for those who don't know, Zelensky was previously, he's a comedian, and it was had a TV show called Servant of the People, which is the name of his political party. The TV show is basically about a high school teacher who almost overnight becomes the president of Ukraine, and then he actually did become the president of Ukraine. And so that was a TV show that aired on a TV channel owned by Kolomoisky. And so, among other things, he's seen as potentially, Ukraine's political system is very oligarchic. So it's like he was seen as the patron or whatever of Zelensky.
And very corrupt.
Yeah, and I mean,
it's funny that you say that, actually, because Sloboda actually said during that interview, everybody in Ukraine's an oligarch.
Yeah, my father's Ukrainian, and after the Soviet Union collapsed, he tried to get several business ventures started in Ukraine over, I'd say, 10 plus years, and he would travel over there very frequently. And he said, at least as far as Ukrainian officials go, every single one of them is corrupt. If you get pulled over for a traffic stop and you give the cop the equivalent in Ukrainian currency of $50, let's say, in American currency, you'll get off without a ticket, and the cop will say, go on your way. And I'm not saying that's pervasive throughout the entire Ukrainian society, but it's like, I always reference him, but Robert Fisk said, in war, there are no good guys. And I think that's true with regard to a lot of the officials in Ukraine, especially nowadays. The corruption is so rampant, and it goes from the police to government officials to just about everything in between.
And ostensibly, that is the priority of the Biden administration policy towards Ukraine, is to root out corruption or whatever. But I mean, I feel like more often than not, that means like replacing bad corruption with good corruption, you know. But there was, going back to what I was saying, it was on March 13th, Washington Post editorial board published an op-ed as the same day as an article in Politico, both of which seem to basically be saying that this was deliberate, that Biden was intentionally keeping, actually the Politico article is titled, Biden Keeping Ukraine at Arm's Length. And they're both basically saying this is a good thing, that it's a good thing that Biden's putting leverage in the Ukrainian government, and like, here. So, and just acknowledging that this is deliberate, and then saying, so the Washington Post article said the new U.S. administration is seeking to induce Mr. Zelensky to tackle his own country's corruption. This is again after he's already done these things of like banning TV stations and moving to remove the head of their like Supreme Court, and basically saying you're not doing enough for a phone call. And then the other Political article, which is more interesting, saying again, in his early days in office, Biden has been keeping the Eastern European ally at arm's length, quietly pushing for further reforms. Some of the Atlantic Council saying there's a real atmosphere of awkwardness between the two governments.
Yeah, just to interject, because you brought up the Atlantic Council, you have a paragraph in your recent piece. Meanwhile, Atlantic Council senior fellow Melinda Herring warned of, quote, impending disaster and dysfunction, unquote, predicting that Rozhansky would, quote, clash, which we've been hearing a lot lately with regard
Such a dumb word.
With regard to what's happening to
Palestine.
In Palestine, yeah. Quote, clash, unquote, with the, quote, very hawkish, unquote, quote, savvy operator, unquote, Victoria Nuland. In other words, he might balance the notoriously neoconservative tendencies of the former Obama State Department advisor, who is widely seen as having stage managed the 2014 Maidan coup in Ukraine. So just because you brought up the Atlantic Council, I just wanted to point that out, that it's not just the Atlantic Council that's growing its tentacles, but it's these people like Victoria Nuland who are coming back around again in the grasp of those tentacles.
Yeah, and I feel
They're
like
bad people. Like these are like the Atlantic Council is filled with terrible. I mean, Henry Kissinger sits on that board, and this chick, you go on to write about how she denies that millions of Russians died in World War II, and all. I mean, these are terrible people. The Atlantic Council is terrible.
Yeah,
Worst people.
they advise Facebook on what's permissible
Yes,
speech
and
and
that
what's not.
just a little tangent on my part. Stop telling me that Facebook is a private company when you are that involved and intermeshed with our government. You don't get to call yourself a private company anymore. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, tangent over.
another
Drives me nuts.
if I can, I want to come back to that, but
Okay.
just to briefly finish this thing, I just want to they're just this political article saying in his nearly 50 days in office, Biden has spoken to close to 24 world leaders, from allies to adversaries to frenemies. But Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, a key partner on the front lines of the battlefield with Russia, is still waiting his turn. And then I think this is a quote from Michael Carpenter, or I suspect, which again speaks to the potential usefulness of him being on the outside. Quote, there is merit to having Zelensky sit and wait his turn for a call, said one former US official who remains close to the Biden administration. He is not struggling with all his might to fight corruption. In fact, pro-Russian oligarchs in Ukraine have gained immense power since Zelensky took over. So there needs to be tough love with Zelensky when that one-on-one conversation does happen. And then, of course, there was this recent situation with the whole military buildup on Ukraine's borders, or also Russia's borders, and someone, other people pointed out, it's like, as of now, I mean, things could change, but as of now, out of that whole situation, Putin is getting a summit with Biden, and Zelensky got a phone call. Like, I think this whole little episode just speaks to, Ukraine being a pawn of this proxy conflict between US and Russia. And another person from the Atlantic Council joked, to Politico in this article, you would think the Ukrainians would have learned that pursuing a phone call with the president of the United States has in the past turned out not to have been a good idea. Ugh. Which to me is just like, basically saying, just sit and wait your turn. Like, like it's essentially like, I think the Banderites and Washington officials kind of have this in common, of like speaking to Ukrainians like they're like little children or something.
Yeah, I was talking with my father about this last night, and we both basically came to the agreement that Ukraine has become a geopolitical playground, or petri dish, if you will, for the US and its anti-Russia campaign. And the US is continually dangling the carrots of NATO membership, EU membership, shipments of Javelin missiles and other armaments to fight Russia, with no intention to give Ukraine any of those. But it's almost like Ukraine's been made into a useful idiot, even though it's not. I'm not calling any Ukrainian an idiot, but I think you get what I'm saying.
It's being used.
It's a
Ukraine
pawn.
Is being used. It's a pawn.
It's a pawn. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you agree with that or not.
Yeah. Something, like this, again, this Washington Post editorial board op-ed was, to me, it was essentially sound like they're saying, like, it's a good thing that Zelensky resisted Trump's pressure in their infamous phone call, and but Zelensky would be well advised to do what Biden wants him to do. Like, don't listen to the orange man, but listen to
the other orange guy.
Yeah,
because he's kind of orange too.
So and it seems, I mean, just, I don't know, it seems that Zelensky is I really, I mean, this is stupid and naive, but I liked the TV show Servant of the People, and so I like wanted to like Zelensky and root for him, but he's not making it easy. But something going back to the whole,
I just think he's way out of his bracket.
Mm.
I don't think he it's not his bailiwick. I don't think he knows what province he's in, and he's white knuckling it, trying to get through it the best he can. Not that he's a stupid guy, but
I mean, he's playing in the big leagues,
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
and
And
that's tough for anybody.
yeah, but I think he's not as seasoned as a lot of other politicians and diplomats, and I think that's problematic for him.
Mm.
Something we see in a lot of younger American politicians like AOC or younger
Oh, I
aspiring.
think she knew exactly what she was getting into. Come on, she interned for Ted Kennedy. She knew. She knows.
I'm not saying I disagree with you, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what her deal is. She seems schizophrenic to me because she's all over the place. She's zesting lemons. She's walking back her support
She
for
does what she's
Palestinian
told.
solidarity. Yeah,
Yeah.
she's on the cover of Rolling Stone with Nancy Pelosi. Yeah,
She's just playing her role. But I think
don't
she
know.
was very well informed about what she was getting into. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. But also I think germane to what we're talking about, because people like her have no idea what's happening in Ukraine. They probably don't even know what NATO is, which is something Max said to me when I interviewed him. He said, I doubt AOC has any idea what NATO even is. And that's a big problem, because that just reinforces their approach to all of this through the lens of Russiagate, which is all they've known since they've been in office. And I think that lack of knowledge here in the US especially is what makes this situation with Ukraine and Russia very, very dangerous.
I think and kind of like a segue, there was a thing where one of the things AOC was getting a lot of flack for, at least on Twitter, was she made some speech, I want to say on the House floor or whatever, about freeing Tibet, and people were like, where did this all come from? But then it's like there's I guess a Tibetan community in her district, and I feel like it's a similar thing with Ukrainian stuff or Ukrainian diaspora or Ukrainian lobbies influence, is that there are politicians in the US who have very significant Ukrainian or have a significant Ukrainian population in their districts, and so they kind of end up becoming beholden to some extent to the Ukrainian community, which in turn organizationally is kind of dominated by these Bandera people. And so at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of the when you see US politicians who like are pandering to Ukrainians, I think electoral like calculations, whatever, plays a large role in it.
100%.
Especially
Yes.
in like Illinois, where, Dick Durbin and I think to a less extent, New York City is not quite as, the Ukrainian community is not as prominent in New York City, but
Tell that to Veselka.
right. But something going back to the whole Rozhansky thing and related, something I think very interesting that came out of this, or not quite necessarily came, well, yeah, but 3 days before this article was published, and only found out about it like a week afterwards. So again, this thing with Rozhansky, he was going to be appointed, or the Biden administration was like considering him, and I think he had been vetted like pretty far along. So it's like pretty clear that they were leaning towards going with him, although, to my knowledge, it was never official that he was nominated or anything. But so again, that position was for the Russia director in the National Security Council. Meanwhile, no one seems to know that. Oh, and again, the other thing is, before him, there was another woman who I'm forgetting her name, who was nominated. And then for reasons I forget, she withdrew her name for consideration. So all the stuff that's been happening with Russia since Biden took office, the National Security Council has not had a Russia director. Meanwhile, it turns out there has been a director for Ukraine and other countries, former Soviet Union countries, since February, but no one seems to like know about. His name is Christopher Smith, or Christopher W. Smith, but as you can imagine, Googling Chris Smith is not very helpful. And so only reason I learned who he is again, this DNC connected group I mentioned, which is still like operating like as an organization, it seems. Ukrainian Americans for Biden, or has a steering committee, which we talked about in a previous thing, and has some Banderite connections, but it's not by any means like a OUNB dominated thing. But anyways, they posted like a press release about how 3 days before this article came out, they were briefed by this guy, Chris Smith, in like a, I don't know, like a 75-minute Zoom meeting. And I'm not sure that, maybe nothing really interesting was said in it, but essentially just, going over the list of here's what the Biden administration plans to do with Ukraine. And, but there were representatives of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and the Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations, this OUNB front I mentioned, who were participating in this meeting, which I think is another sign of this like nexus's influence in Washington, that, here they are playing a role in canceling or blocking the Russia director, and now here they are meeting with the Ukraine director. And also, it kind of makes me wonder, it seems like there's, on one hand, no shortage of people in the Biden world or Biden administration who, for them, Ukraine is something of a priority. People like Tony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, Mike Carpenter. But so this guy, Chris Smith, well, I just kind of can't help but wonder if he's playing a pretty central role in this stuff, coordinating things with like Ukrainian government or so. For one, as I mentioned, well, it's my understanding that a lot of these controversial or unconstitutional stuff the Ukrainian government's been doing since Biden came to office has been their National Security Council has been the impetus for it. And so Chris Smith from 2014 to 2018 was a high ranking official at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine. He ran their International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Division. And so he gave his first interview in Ukraine in 2017. It may have been the last, but in any case, it seems to be the only one in English. And so just to read a little from the introduction about him, it was with a site called censor.net, saying not too many people see and realize, and again, this is 2017, not too many people see and realize the extent of the U.S. sustained influence on the profound reform processes and decision-making by Ukrainian politicians, and how critical the U.S. diplomat's stance regarding our problems is. Mr. Smith is the person acquainted with all top law enforcers. He is not just a U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, but the one who is actually involved in many reform processes and creation of the new government bodies, the one who is on friendly terms with the chiefs of all law enforcement agencies. Sometimes he even plays a role of a psychotherapist helping to resolve conflicts between Ukrainian senior officials. So,
wow.
Yeah, so
that's a CV for you.
Yeah,
right?
So, maybe it's a little of a tinfoil hat or whatever, but to me, I kind of wonder if he's like the guy, not necessarily calling the shots, but the one who's like implementing them.
Yeah, sort of like a John Bolton figure who's not voted, he's appointed, and as national security advisor, John Bolton could pretty much, if his policies weren't implemented, he could suggest any sort of policies he wanted, which were obviously all neoconservative regime change policies. But I think you might be onto something there with Chris Smith, that
I think so.
Yeah, he's not necessarily an outside player, but he's more inside than we know. And
he has a very low profile.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it seems that, albeit John Bolton, who doesn't have a low profile, that it
I like to
seems,
call John Bolton the death walrus.
yeah, yeah, or the death stash.
Yeah.
But it seems like for the most part, people like that uh, purposely remain or try to remain incognito. But
They
yeah,
can get away with more terrible shit that way.
I haven't heard of Chris Smith, but
No, and no one has
I haven't
seemingly. No,
either.
his appointment has not been reported by anybody from what I can tell. But his official
That's
title,
suspect all by itself.
well, his official
Yeah.
title, and he's had it since February. Okay, so it's like, it's interesting. Again, Biden comes into office and seemingly or reportedly is keeping the Ukrainian government at arm's length. They don't have a Russia director on the National Security Council for months, and they're not having high level or like, head of state to head of state communication. But then these things are happening once Biden comes into office in Ukraine, and seemingly you don't know when exactly, the month of February. It's presumably after the move with these 3 TV channels are banned. But I do kind of wonder if that happened and they're like, oh, we need to get someone in there, and they went with this guy. And his official title, it's okay, I don't have it, but I think it's like director for Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the Caucasus. So it sounds like he has a good amount of responsibility. And he's had this position for February, March, April, like going on 4 months. And from what I can tell, it's his appointment has not been reported by anybody.
I certainly haven't heard it anywhere.
Except
No.
for Ukrainian Americans for Biden, which is essentially an obscure little DNC outfit, posts this press release.
Yeah,
And
but
We should ask Robbie, because
we're
Robbie
making
has
them
been,
famous.
well, Robbie's been, he has like a thread keeping track of all of Biden appointments, and he's been kind of like going through all of their financial connections, because that's what Robbie does. So we should ask Robbie if he started this guy, because if anybody has, because Robbie's been paying very close attention to every appointment made. So we should definitely ask him and see if he started this dude. I'd be interested to see what his financial connections are too.
yeah.
So, Moss, 2 people I want to ask you about. The first being Hannah Hopko.
Oy.
Can you talk about her and her dream of balkanizing Russia, which just balkanize as a verb, that doesn't bode well for anything, whatever you apply it to. But can you talk about her and her influence?
Admittedly, I don't know like a whole ton about her, but I can definitely talk about her. Hannah Hopko is interesting. I'll say she's definitely like a Ukrainian nationalist. She's from Western Ukraine, from Lviv, who it's just like the basically cultural capital of Western Ukraine, and
Which has gone back and forth between Poland and Ukraine.
right,
over
and it's
years.
and being from Western Ukraine doesn't make you a nationalist automatically, but it's interesting because she is both a nationalist and she's like a darling of the West. In 2014, she was elected. I think that would have been October, November. They had their parliamentary elections in 2014. She was elected with the Self-Reliance Party, which is like a pro-Western political party, which to my knowledge, I don't know if they still really are significant at this point. But she, so again, was elected in 2014. And then as of December 2014, became the chair of the Ukrainian Parliament's committee, like on foreign affairs.
Is that CUSUR?
No, that's the OUMB front group in DC, Center for U.S. Ukrainian Relations.
Okay.
But she seems to be a very good friend mutually of the Banderites. And when I say Banderites, I don't mean this in the sense that like Soviet and Russian propaganda has a history of describing any Ukrainian nationalist or any Ukrainian dissident as a Banderite, but like,
Right.
I mean someone who is actually involved in the OUNB Banderite and So she's a good friend of the Banderite, the Banderites, and is also a very good friend of Western officials. In, as I said, as the as the Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs, or the chairperson. She spent a lot of time in DC, actually at a CUSUR event, which she's spoken many times in recent years. This OUMB front group, where they have conferences multiple times a year, every year in DC. The international leader of the OUMB, who's an Australian guy, made this joke that Hannah Hopko practically lives in Washington. And there was the whole issue of that Ukrainian politician who released these phone calls between Biden and Poroshenko, which were kind of like little clips. It wasn't full conversations. But at one point, my timeline's a little fuzzy. I'm going to guess and say 2017 or so, 2016.
We'll have our fact checker.
Okay.
Well, there was somebody on the staff take care of that.
Yeah.
There was
our intern.
They were looking for there's a question of who the new prime minister was going to be. And previously there was a whole kind of like conflict between the president, Poroshenko, and the prime minister, Yatsenyuk. And so I think basically Poroshenko was trying to replace Yatsenyuk with like a Poroshenko friendly politician. Ultimately, he succeeded, with the chairman of parliament becoming the new prime minister, and then the deputy chairman of parliament, Parubi, that neo-Nazi guy, or has a history of neo-Nazi stuff, became the chairman of parliament. But the other person in the running was Natalia Yaresko, who's from Chicago. Her brother is like the president of the parish board of this church in a suburb of Chicago, where this like the OUNB had this conclave that, in an effort to like organize this coup of this organization in New York City that we talked about previously. Which is to say, not necessarily that she's a Banderite, but like her family and all are in that get along with them. So
they rub shoulders.
And so there was a conversation, actually, I don't know, maybe I'm getting things a little bit wrong. I don't know that Poroshenko was necessarily rooting for the one guy and not her, because he had a conversation in one of these like leaked conversations with Biden. Poroshenko was saying, if I remember correctly, was saying that, to get the votes for this woman Yaresko to become prime minister, and that didn't happen, that they needed votes from this party that Hannah Hopko was a part of. And she actually either got expelled or left that party at some point. But what I'm getting at is that Poroshenko actually asked Biden for help to put pressure on this party to support Yaresko's candidacy for prime minister, because, as Poroshenko was saying, like, we understand that this party is very close with like US officials or with the embassy or something like that. And so, I don't know if Hannah Hopko is some like CIA type person, but it's like, seems like she might as well be.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
your piece is the first time I've heard of her.
Yeah, same here. She sounds like a real peach, though, really.
It doesn't even sound like a real name, though. Hannah Hopko.
Well,
I've heard weirder.
But she, at the end of that article, I did include a photo of Blinken and Hopko meeting in 2015. Oh, it's something I forgot to mention. So right around the time she becomes, in December 2014, the chairman of their Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, she went to DC to receive a democracy award from the National Democratic Institute, which again is this like US government funded democracy promotion organization, which is like essentially the democracy promotion arm of the Democratic Party. At that event, she met Biden, who was there as vice president. And I don't know that they got a picture together, but I think like she did get a photo, I think, with like Madeleine Albright. And so whatever.
Stand up gal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, she's very close with like Western officials and so on. And on the other hand, she's also very close to she's a total nationalist. She co-sponsored a law in, I want to say 2018, that was about something about rehabilitating veterans of the Organization of Ukraine Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. These organizations, which not everyone was in it was necessarily a Nazi collaborator individual, but these organizations were definitely tainted by Nazi collaboration and, you know, participation in the Holocaust, and ethnic cleansing of Poles in Western Ukraine, and all kinds of horrific stuff. And also, you know, they also killed a lot of Ukrainians too. But so she was involved in getting this status as recognizing the OUN UPA as freedom fighters. She more recently attended a protest against Zelensky, where it was like, at least, yeah, that day she went, there was a very strong like neo-Nazi and far-right extremist presence, including the National Corps, which is the political wing of the Azov movement. And you know, she took a picture with like the flyer, and then behind her is like the neo-Nazi flags, and she posted that on Twitter, like something to the
Wow.
effect of like, happy to be here today, you know. So someone who is not like a Nazi, but like almost literally
I love being in
Nazi
a throng
adjacent.
of white supremacist men.
She's like a fangirl.
And so she is again going to her nationalism. Something I think she has in common with the Banderites, although they aren't as vocal about it, is this idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't go far enough, and that the Russian Federation itself is like a empire or something that needs to be broken up. And does go back, is like have a history. The Nazis essentially want to do the same thing of balkanizing Russia. There is like a lot of people think of Russia as, don't realize that Russia is a very diverse country. And for example, the thing that she's passionate about is freedom or whatever for the so-called Idel Ural, which is like this idea of like a Turkic, like ethno-nationalist state in the middle of, essentially in the middle of Russia.
Yeah, there's a good tweet you included in your piece from Leonid Rogozin, with whom I have some disagreements over the so-called Uyghur situation. But he posted fun video of a Ukrainian politician imagining her visit. This is Hannah Hopko, to the future Idel Ural state in what is Russia's Volga region today. Idel Ural is a Tatar-centric nationalist project which most prominently manifested itself as the namesake Hitler's Ostlegionen unit. I know German is phonetic, but I don't know if I got that right. But that's what you were starting to talk about, and I thought that was very interesting, because it's like going back to these sort of archaic, arbitrary, it seems, racial divisions.
And that so that panel she's on, well, for one thing, she was saying and that was at, again, this event, it was a Zoom because of the pandemic, but a Zoom conference organized by this group, CUSUR, Center for U.S. Ukraine Relations, OUNB Front Group, executive director of which is allegedly the U.S. leader of the OUNB. In any case, he is definitely a leading member of the OUNB in the United States. Walter Zaritsky. We previously talked about this, and like I met him once and we got a picture. And but he was on that. Also on that was Herman Perchner, who we talked about earlier, and also on that Dan Freed of the Atlantic Council, who I wrote about in the article, who really like articulated what I think is the kind of consensus of the Hawks, that they don't want any debate in the Biden administration when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. And then also there was another person at the Atlantic Council, Adrian Karatnitsky, who is who's kind of an odd bird, but he is has a history of, as I said, the CIA supported this other group of ex-Banderites, and he was, as a student in the 70s, worked part-time for the CIA front. I imagine unwitting, but he then did go on to, he was like president of Freedom House for 12 years and other things. And to me, he seems to be the most prominent person in the so-called blob, who has openly, publicly acknowledged that there still is a clandestine OUNB network. And so it's an interesting panel. And so when she brought up her dream of balkanizing Russia, they all like started laughing and
Nice.
smiling. Not the, with the exception of the guy Dan Freed. He didn't say anything.
Yeah,
But
that Freed guy though, like you were talking about how they don't want any dissent, or they don't want any discussion about this. And there's a quote in the article where he says, quote, "will not be a return." The Biden administration, quote, "will not be a return to the Obama administration. It will be a return to the best sides of the Obama administration without some of the disheartening debates that happened internally."
And then I didn't include
what does that even mean?
Well, so he went a little further with that quote, is that I cut out. I didn't include the full quote. He was like, without some of the disheartening debates, the results of which we see, essentially implying that the whole situation in Ukraine today
is
is
because
a result,
of debate.
well, yeah, is a result of the Obama administration being too weak, or not, didn't want to stand up to Putin in Ukraine, and that's the source of the problems. Or at least that's kind of how I read it. Another thing Michael Carpenter said, also at a Center for U.S. Ukraine Relations event in years past, was he caught himself and he kind of like watered it down a bit. But the thing he was starting to say was that the Obama administration was afraid of its own shadow. I mean, this is Joe Biden's like key foreign policy guy, and he's saying the Obama administration was afraid of its own shadow. And then he went and said,
Jesus.
"Oh, some of them, like, and." But one last thing about this Hopko thing, Walter Zaritsky, executive director of Center U.S. Ukraine Relations, I found a photo of him in 1985, which I tweeted out, where he was at a meeting of the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. Scott and John Lee Anderson. John Lee Anderson now writes for like the New Yorker, I believe. They wrote a book, the first like expose of the World Anti-Communist League. The Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which was led by the Banderites, was essentially like the Eastern European component of the World Anti-Communist League, and like a very important part of it.
And this was in what year or which decade again?
Well, so it was something, the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations was created in 1946, existed till 1996. The World Anti-Communist League set up in 1967, and more or less, it became something else in 1999, and after the Cold War ended, or after the Soviet Union ceased to exist.
So these came about decades after the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviki. They weren't even entities anymore.
Right. Well, they these Nazi collaborator type people, like the word Bolshevik. It has the whole, because I don't know, it does have some kind of not necessarily anti-Semitic connotations, but it's definitely there floating around. But what I was just getting at is that the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations basically it started the Cold War saying World War III is inevitable, and it ended the Cold War saying we're the only ones who can stop World War III from happening, which basically implied, like, by creating a war, like they felt that, I don't know, it's complicated, but they had some components of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations did stem to the Nazi Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, which was one of these ministries that the Nazis set up to oversee the conquered territories that they were grabbing in the East during World War II. And there was like a whole bunch of different interlocking bureaucracies or whatever. But the guy who had that was Alfred Rosenberg, who was like, is arguably the guy who was kind of like the Hitler's like almost chief ideologue. He kind of got shafted a bit in the Nazi hierarchy, but he's largely the one who planted the seed in Hitler's mind that, the Jews are behind
which is
communism.
interesting because Rosenberg is a Jewish name.
Right. Yeah. But
typically
there was an official Rosenberg was executed as a result of Nuremberg. He died in 1946, but he had an official who, he had representatives at the Wannsee Conference and stuff, but he had another guy, Gerhard von Mend, who brought some of these, his ministry set up these so-called national committees, which I think mainly just existed on paper, but like there was like a Caucasus committee, there was an Ideal Ural committee, there was others. And some of these, this guy von Mend basically brought them into the ABN, or the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which was led by, as I said, the Ukrainians. So there actually is a history of this, a direct line where Hannah Hopko was speaking at a conference organized by this guy, Walter Zaritsky, who was in turn used to be a member of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which had an Ideal Ural committee that traced back to literally the Nazi like government. And Hannah Hopko was talking about, as the Foreign Affairs Committee chair in her office, she's no longer in Parliament, but again, 2014, 2019, she had in her office a map of Russia with the like so-called like subjugated nations within Russia that she wanted to liberate. So she is someone who's very passionate about balkanizing Russia. And it does have a direct history going back to, what the Nazis wanted to do. And yeah, so she's kind of perfectly at this intersection of the Banderites, Western officials, far-right Ukrainian nationalists.
And at the end of your most recent piece, you have a picture of Hannah Hopko in 2015 meeting with Tony Blinken face to face, and there's some kind of document or large picture perhaps between them. I don't know exactly.
It almost looks like a book of some kind. I don't know what that is.
It looks like a gift.
Yeah. Who knows?
With a picture of drone footage on it. That's what it looks like.
But she is like a pretty right-wing, at least right-wing aligned Ukrainian nationalist politician, even if she's not in parliament anymore. And I'm sure like Blinken and Biden remember her and they know her.
Of course.
And so
something I'm always struck by when we talk to you is how closely related Joe Biden is to a bunch of like neo-Nazis. And everybody was freaking out because Donald Trump was such a Nazi. But really, Joe Biden has a shit ton of connections to these people.
Well, I would say it's more almost like Biden's like inner circle. Because I don't know that Biden himself has too much to do with these people, but like directly, but I'm sure he's not that out of the loop of what like Michael Carpenter and Tony Blinken, whoever, are up to.
He's certainly going along with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
So we've had you for a bit here, and
Oh yeah, we have. We do this all the time.
we
Sorry,
can
Moss.
No,
we
yeah.
can we can start wrapping up. Although I feel like there's so
We
much
can
more to
always have
talk
Moss
about.
back. I love having Moss on.
Yeah,
So,
Yeah,
oh,
thank
Moss,
you.
I meant to tell you too. Our friend Sleepy Josh, who's like the tech guy for like a lot of people, he works for everybody. But you're like one of our favorite guests that we have on because he
Oh,
said he learns a ton from your episodes. So I
that's
just
great.
wanted to let
Thank
you know
you.
that. Shout out to Sleepy Josh. We
Yeah.
love you.
Hi, Josh. uh, One of the things I wanted to ask you, and it's a pretty general, pretty broad question, but what do you predict or what do you see with regard to the Biden administration and Russia and Ukraine going forward, at least in the near future? Like, do you
Yeah.
see a ramping up of hostility or trying to just keep some sort of form of stable containment, if you will?
I don't know. Honestly, I mean, I someone who my interest in all this stuff originally comes from being interested in the history. And so I'm just generally speaking much more comfortable looking back than looking forward. But I do think
Yeah, I'm not asking you to etch this in
oh,
stone,
I know,
but
but I
just
think
what your hunches may be.
I feel the thing that I think I was getting at in the previous show too is that I feel like this something that concerns me is this what happens if the Biden administration essentially decides it's not happy with Zelensky, not saying that it wants to like overthrow him or something, but um, if the Biden administration essentially is going to decide that it's not satisfied with the Zelensky government, um, does it directly or indirectly, you know, give some kind of support, and I mean that very broadly, to the to the like nationalist opposition to Zelensky, such as people like Hannah Hopko, um, you know, like uh, that they're gonna hypothetically say, you know, we're better off working with someone like Hannah Hopko than Zelensky's people. Like Michael Carpenter, for one, seems to believe that um, you know, that Zelensky's not like necessarily a puppet of Putin, but that like Putin's puppets have all kinds of are gaining power and have all this influence behind the scenes. I mean, it seemed to me like he was kind of implying that they have influence in his government, and you know, if that's what they believe, then
They probably do. And Ukraine probably has influence in Russia's government as well. There's the line between the two countries, both geopolitically and in terms of heritage and ethnicity, is it's so threadbare that there's such a transfer back and forth between Ukrainians and Russians. And a lot of them, according to my father, at least when I've spoken to him about this, is that uh, a lot of them are very friendly with each other and they get along and they don't care that somebody's Ukrainian or somebody's Russian.
you're talking about just like average people.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about those who are fighting. Yeah, average Ukrainians, average Russians. It's not that they don't care about what's happening, but I think a lot of them see the division as an arbitrary, forced ethnic division.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that actually reminds me, the other thing that kind of concerns me is that, you know, if nothing else, Zelensky's unprecedented, like 73% landslide election victory in 2019 was, you know, Ukrainian voters clearly rejected like the nationalists. I mean, kind of like every year, and it's a point a lot of people like to make, is that, you know, the far right does abysmal when it comes to elections. But then also Poroshenko had he had come into office, this like moderate whatever oligarch, pro-Western, and he left like pretty much a national, like pretty in the nationalist camp. His re-election slogan was something like "Army, Life, Faith," and it really
Arbeit macht frei.
yeah, and it really backfired. I mean, this like his turn to the right or turn to nationalism. He got just under 25% of the vote. So that was, I think, really significant. That for like it was basically Ukrainian people saying that they're not that these nationalists don't represent average Ukrainians, and yet with Zelensky, it's like first I was saying, well, if he doesn't satisfy Biden administration, are they going to end up somehow empowering the like far right nationalists who basically want to overthrow him? Or does Zelensky cater to the Biden administration and in doing so erode his own support, which seems to be what he's done? He's not the nationalists when he came into office, essentially they declared calling it the red lines that he's not about to cross, and essentially threatening to overthrow him if he crosses these red lines, which is not a very healthy democracy where you have these like fascist thugs on the street who get to if like imagine if like Trump people or whatever were like, if Biden goes back into the Iran deal or whatever, like threatening a revolution. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine a similar scenario in the US, but yeah, it does seem it's almost like damned if he does, damned if he doesn't sort of situation, where if he goes his own individual way, the Biden administration, I could see like giving him the cold shoulder even further, or some kind of hysteria, Russiagate type hysteria. Like, is he going to get Russiagated? Or if he caters to the Biden administration, undermining his own support. And so in both scenarios, I feel like there's a threat of the nationalists
taking over. He's kind
yeah.
of in a lose-lose situation there, really. I mean, because you're right. I know you're trying to like be diplomatic about it, but it's not like the United States hasn't and won't continue to overthrow governments that don't do what they say.
Yeah.
That's what we do. I mean, if you are not willing to be a puppet of the West, we will come in and arm the opposition and train the opposition and fund the opposition. Doesn't matter how right wing and radical and extremist they are, and we will overthrow you. And that's just what we do. But you're right. If he doesn't, acquiesce and capitulate to Western ideals and what the Biden administration wants, then he is either going to get overthrown, or if he does do that, he'll just lose all of his support and get voted out anyway.
And I don't think like the US government would want to organize like a coup against him or whatever, but like it's easy to imagine such a thing getting out of hand, which to some extent I feel like is what happened in 2014, which might be a little unpopular opinion, but it's like Obama said in an interview with CNN once, where he was admitting that the US tried to spearheaded, negotiated a transfer of power. The deal that the Obama administration brokered, that's the word I was looking for, was that that Yanukovych, that they were going to have early elections, and essentially it was like a transition of power. And
which right there, sorry to interrupt, but right there, that should give anybody pause. What business does the Obama administration have in negotiating internal Ukrainian politics?
Well, of course, yeah. But I mean, I feel like what I'm saying is, I feel like the Obama administration was, if anything, trying to orchestrate like a soft coup, and instead got a more hard coup, which is pretty frequently, at least on the left, referred to as like a CIA orchestrated neo-Nazi coup. And I feel like I don't think the CIA wanted to orchestrate a so-called neo-Nazi coup. I think it's almost like things got out of hand. But then again, I don't really know. But it seems like, like the Obama administration wanted a more peaceful transition of power, and it's not what they got. And so I could see a scenario, and again, I'm not an expert, I don't even know Ukrainian, but I could easily imagine a scenario in which, say, the Biden administration wants to give a little bit of support to the nationalists as like a way to just put leverage or put pressure on Zelensky. And who knows, maybe that gets out of hand. It's just all very
yeah, and I think
convoluted and crazy.
Yeah, and I think what's what might be a big problem eventually is that Zelensky seems, at least on the surface, to be a very vulnerable and malleable person, somebody who could be swayed either way depending on what he deems is beneficial to his own power. I just see him as a very vacillating sort of politician, an opportunist, and probably the perfect fall guy for whatever imperial designs are being drawn up right now. And
I also imagine that he's like also just genuinely scared of some of these
Yeah.
people. Like I think even
I
the
would be.
the Poroshenko government was, I think, scared of them to some extent, and they were more or less allied with the nationalists. In this case, they're almost all opposed to Zelensky's government and make some pretty threatening things. The original leader, founder of Right Sector, once said, or at least once said, that if Zelensky betrays the nation, by which they pretty much just mean like compromises with Russia, that he'll be lynched. And there's another guy who has repeatedly made references to Zelensky. He's going to end up like Gaddafi.
Oy.
And it's like, meanwhile, the head of I think we talked about this last time. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to just keep it very brief. But the
we're not rushing you. We just don't want
Okay.
to keep you too long.
Well, but so the OUNB launched this thing in 2019 called the Capitulation Resistance Movement. Or more directly, I think translates as like the movement to resist capitulation or movement against capitulation. But English, they refer to themselves as the Capitulation Resistance Movement. And to put things in perspective, the Maidan, which was actually the like second Maidan, because first you had the Orange Revolution in 2004, 2005. So the Euromaidan, or the second Maidan, was from November 2013 to February 2014. So that's like just what, a few months. The capitulation
like
resistance. Yeah, and so the capitulation resistance movement has been trying to make the third Maidan a thing, or has been threatening to launch like a third Maidan for like a year and a half now.
Because the second one worked out so well.
Yeah, but at least the second one had genuine popular support. This one, it's pretty much the efforts to get this third Maidan or whatever off the ground is pretty much, it's, I think, much more clearly dominated by the far right. You have the neo-Nazi led Azov movement behind this thing called like the No to Capitulation campaign, and then you have the capitulation resistance movement. And then so one of the leaders of the capitulation resistance movement is the guy who's making these veiled threats about Gaddafi and his fate. And the leader, who seems to be the leader of the capitulation resistance movement, is an OUNB guy who, at least according to him, has known Michael Carpenter quite well for years. So, eventually, I feel like, I think a lot of people who are like experts or whatever scoff at the idea of like a so-called third Maidan, but there are other people who will tell you that it's like a matter of when, not if. I'm kind of agnostic on the whole thing.
Right.
But if at a certain point, it's like, if the Biden administration isn't doing anything to tamper or to like control these people, then that makes me think that it's essentially an endorsement. The capitulation resistance movement right now is like launching a pro NATO campaign. Like, it's like very clearly their messaging is clearly, seemingly, to me, it seems like geared for trying to appeal to Western support. And has this kind of face, which is just a facade of being like having a liberal face or whatever, because they have a coordination council which is dominated by these nationalists, and then they have an advisory strategic council which has like former diplomats and stuff who, if you didn't know any better, you'd think that that's the leadership. And like the Atlantic Council once posted a statement that referred to this capitulation resistance movement as like a democratic bipartisan movement, when it's really not that. And so, and again, this group, Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations, over the past 2 years has been giving a platform to the people behind this thing, and often from the so-called Strategic Council. And so I do feel like there's an effort by the same Bandera lobby, Ukraine lobby, same people who are canceling Brzezinski are also trying to find support in Washington for this movement, which, I feel like could very, if they get anywhere, they're going to lose control to the neo-Nazis. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah. No, that all makes sense. It's definitely something that we need to keep an eye on. I don't think enough people are talking about this. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, Ukraine's going to be something to watch for a while, I think.
Yeah,
So-
even people who do try to report on it, they can't say the name of the country correctly. It's not the Ukraine, it's Ukraine. And anytime I hear, okay, somebody can slip up, but anytime I hear that repeated by somebody who's supposed to be, CNN's expert on Eastern European affairs or some such childish title, they always refer to it as the Ukraine, and that betrays a lot, I think, with regard to how little they know about what they're talking about, if they know anything. And that's another danger too, is that you get these people on these mainstream media outlets who don't really know what they're talking about, and they're regurgitating talking points that fit the permissible narrative, and we get more Russiagate, we get more Russia is the boogeyman trying to wipe Ukraine off the map, which we all know is not true. But a lot of people believe that, and it perpetuates the Russophobia, the new Red Scare. And again, as we said earlier, Ukraine is kind of like this like imperialists' playground in the middle of it. And I think with somebody like Zelensky in power, especially, it's very, very much a tinderbox, even though I hate that expression.
But it's a good, I mean, that's a good descriptor. You know?
It's like on every page of the New York Times, but yeah. I won't say clashes though.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right, Moss, though, that it's hard to, obviously it's impossible to predict the future, but it's also hard to say because there are so many moving parts here. Not just the groups that we've talked about, but individuals within those groups, like Hannah Hopko, whom I've never heard of, but apparently was or is or has been a big player. So I think it's a labyrinth that we have to keep negotiating to try to find out what the US's intentions are. I think we can pretty much glean what they are, but there's a lot, I think, still to come out.
Also, something that remains to be seen too is, like, yes, the Biden administration seems to be stacked with hawks, but sometimes people get into power and then they become more realist now that they have the responsibility of and so so we didn't talk about the whole situation with the Russian buildup, but it's been suggested. People have had all different kinds of ideas about what Putin's motivations and messaging are. But one idea that's been thrown out there, I think New York Times included it, was that that Putin essentially wanted to provoke a reaction from the West, but one that would underwhelm the Ukrainian government and show that, like, the West is not going to save you. Like if Russia wanted to invade Ukraine, that, NATO is not going to come to their defense, which I think is probably accurate. Like throughout the Cold War, State Department, US government, they didn't really care about Ukraine. They didn't even pretend to. Now they pretend to, but they don't really.
Right.
And we all know that, but also, to the extent that they don't want to actually, there might be some exceptions. I'm sure there are, but generally speaking, they don't want to go to war to defend Ukraine. It's like they want to say they will, and
Right.
it's scary that maybe they could, but at the end of the
I
day,
think a lot of this is posturing.
Yeah. And that's another situation where Ukraine is just like a pawn or whatever. Because it's like, I think another thing which I don't have in front of me, but I think New York Times was, so like Obama administration did not want to arm Ukraine. And now you got people like Michael Carpenter, Dan Freed, who want to give the Obama administration a lot of flack and basically just sound like John McCain or any other hawkish Republican on the issue of accusing Obama of being weak and yada, 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 and letting all this happen. But then the Biden, and so Trump obviously armed Ukraine somewhat. Now Biden administration wants to arm Ukraine even more, but they also don't want to give too many arms to Ukraine. Like they want to give enough to be like, we are strong, we support Ukraine, but they don't want to give enough to give the Ukrainian government confidence to think that they can actually stand up to Russia. So it's all posturing. And so at the end of the day, there might not actually be such a huge difference between the Biden administration, the Obama administration, or even the Trump administration when it comes to Ukraine. But again, I guess we'll see.
Well, it again points to the big point that we've been hammering, that Ukraine is a pawn and it's being used by the US to, not only threaten Russia, but I think to create political discombobulation within Ukraine so that Ukrainian politics, the Ukrainian government gets almost constipated in a sense, and is desperate for assistance from whomever's willing to offer it, in this case the US. But I think you're right that the US is going to give them enough to make it feel like they have enough to defend themselves, but not enough to actually go to full out war with Russia. And I think that's totally in line with how the US operates so cynically with its geopolitics. But
I think another component too is, I think it was in December that again, like Zelensky and his party, their support has really created over the years. It's to be expected when you start with the high watermark of 73% voting for you. But I think it was in December that the pro-Russian political party For Life, which is associated with the guy Medvedchuk, whose TV channels were banned like a month or 2 months later, that party had overtaken Servant of the People in opinion polls in December of 2020. So that seems to be part of what all this is about, is Zelensky wanting to deal with the Russian aligned or pro-Russian, whatever, Russian sympathetic, however you want to put it, political opposition in Ukraine. And but it doesn't seem to be a winning strategy.
Well, we're definitely going to have to keep our eyes on this thing, because and I love having Moss on anyway, so it's always good to just talk Ukraine and try to figure some of this shit out. But thanks for coming on. I am sorry that we kept you so long. We tend to do that especially when we're talking about stuff that we're very interested in. So you guys can find Moss online. You can find him on Twitter. Do you want to tell everybody your Twitter and all that stuff, where they can find you? You can find this newest piece that we've been talking about on the Gray Zone. You guys should definitely check that one out. But tell everybody where they can find everything.
Okay, my Twitter is Moss Robeson, Robeson. ___. And then I have a Substack, although it's all free. I don't have any paid subscription. I'm kind of on like a little bit of a hiatus this month, but I'll be back. And that's Banderite, one word, .substack.com.
Yeah,
Cool.
and I recommend anybody with whatever amount of knowledge you have of what we've discussed today to go to Moss's Substack and read his pieces, because they're very well informed, very researched, very accurate and cited in what they're saying, and definitely providing a perspective that we're not getting much from anywhere else, if at all. So do check that out. Do follow him on Twitter. We'll link to everything we talked about in the show notes. And so to wrap up, our guest today has been Moss Robeson and Robeson, sorry.
No, it's Robeson.
And, oh, it's Robeson.
Robeson.
Yeah, it's fine. I don't really. It's
Can't keep track of names anymore.
no, it's fine. A lot of people say Robeson, so I don't even usually correct.
Moss Robeson. And see, I did a kind of hybrid there. He is an independent researcher and writer, and he has focused mostly on Ukrainian politics and the rise of neo-Nazism and other white supremacist factions within Ukraine under the umbrella of the Bandera lobby that still exists there. And so, as you probably heard in the show, we didn't get to a lot of points, so we're probably going to have part 2 if Moss is cool with that.
Oh, yeah.
So stay tuned for that. And Moss, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.